Hi, everyone. I wanted to start by thanking you for joining this special episode of the Immigration Lawyers Podcast with well-known immigration attorney and author Ira J. Kurzban, who was kind enough to sit down and talk with us about his career and his thoughts about the practice of immigration law. I know a lot of practitioners are going to enjoy this one. The conversation gets pretty serious at some point since we're going through very serious times in our country. I hope it can resonate with you to make decisions larger than just your law practice. But before starting, I also wanted to thank all the new subscribers to the Immigration Lawyers Toolbox subscription service, which includes my daily tips, access to the monthly mastermind calls, and additional training material. With the publishing of this interview, I am also releasing a seminar on business development entitled Maximizing Your Branding and Marketing through Avvo.com with immigration attorney Carl Schusterman. This type of material will only be available with a subscription, but I've made access to the video recording free for the first week it is released by going to the immigrationlawyerstoolbox.com webpage and finding it under the Training Masterclass page. Without further ado, let's get it started. Welcome to the Immigration Lawyers Podcast. I am the host, Attorney John Khosravi, and I practice U.S. immigration law exclusively. For more information about the program, please visit www.immigrationlawyerspodcast.com. Please note that this recording is informational only and does not constitute legal advice. Please consult with a licensed attorney for specific legal guidance that suits your case. Also, this recording is copyrighted and written permission is required for rebroadcasting. For more information about me, please visit www.jqqlaw.com. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this podcast episode. It's a wonderful addition because we have the famous Ira Kurzban with us to share his knowledge and experience. Thank you. So, Ira, we'll just jump into it. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and just where you grew up and then how you got involved in law?
Sure. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. I'm the son of an immigrant. My father came from Romania.
Okay.
And he had quite a story that's much more interesting than mine. He came when he was 12 years old on his own, and was escaping basically anti-Semitism from Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So he really kind of exemplifies a lot of what we see today of people trying to come to the border and so forth, and came, built a life in the U.S., raised 4 sons. All of us, 2 of us were lawyers. One's a doctor, one's an engineer. The classic story about immigration, I've lived through, and I'm very grateful for, which is one of the reasons why I'm so motivated and love immigration. I think I really got it from my family. So I grew up in New York. Had no interest actually in being an immigration lawyer when I went to law school.
Mm-hmm.
Became a civil rights lawyer when I graduated, and became a labor lawyer actually at the time. I worked for an organization, part-time pro bono, called the National Emergency Civil Liberties Committee, which was started in the 1950s to assist people before the McCarthy Committee. And they then went on to do great cases. They did cases, for example, the first comparable worth case. They represented Daniel Ellsberg. They managed to get the first person seated who was an African American after Reconstruction in the South. And they did all these incredible cases. And the first set of immigration cases they did were the Haitian cases in South Florida. 2 cases, Marie Sanon versus the United States and Marie Pierre versus the United States. So when I graduated law school, they asked me, would I come down to Florida? And I started practicing labor law with my brother, who was down here in Florida for a couple of years, and started to do civil rights cases. And some of those cases were quite interesting. They involved land claims on behalf of Seminole Indians. But one of the major cases was the class action lawsuit on behalf of Haitian refugees who were seeking, remember, this was before the Refugee Act. This was before 1980. So the only basis to seek refugee status in the U.S. was the Convention and Protocol relating to the status of refugees, and they sued under that. So that kind of got me involved, and then I got involved with something from the National Council of Churches and the Christian Community Service Agency. Both of those organizations needed a lawyer because they were starting something called the Haitian Refugee Center. And I helped to get the Haitian Refugee Center started. And then when the Haitians themselves said, you know, we want to run our own organization, they split off. I went with the Haitian community, really. And one of my great heroes, who's since passed away, Father Gerard Jean Just, was the leader of the Haitian Refugee Center. We started our own organization. And from that point on, we probably brought 10 or 15 major class action lawsuits over the next 10 years, two of which wound up in the Supreme Court. Actually, three ultimately wound up in the Supreme Court. So it was that was kind of my start in practicing immigration. And I didn't know very much about immigration. I knew a lot about litigation and about civil rights work, and I kind of learned immigration by going through it.
Interesting. And so when did you start taking just typical, cases for employment-based or marriage case? Did you make a switch to that, or have you always done the full gamut?
Well, I think we've always done the whole gamut, but I really started to practice immigration law. I would say probably in the very late 70s, early 80s. I started doing immigration litigation probably 1978, and then 1979 when we did Haitian Refugee Center versus Civiletti, which became a very well-known case. But after that point, I started to pick up kind of regular clients one way or another. I've never had a huge corporate practice, although today we do everything from EB-5 to simple adjustment applications to cases in the U.S. Supreme Court to major class actions. We were just involved in the TPS litigation on a pro bono basis for Haitians, and we got a 150-page decision from the district court, basically stopping immigration from trying to deport anybody who has TPS, and we got the TPS program completely enjoined.
Wonderful. And so when did you get involved with AILA yourself through this process? So did you join when you started going these Haitian cases, or because AILA's been around since I think 1960s or earlier?
Oh, even earlier. AILA started in 1946.
Oh, wow. Right after the war.
And I really got involved in AILA at the beginning of the 1980s. I remember, I think the first conference I was ever asked to speak at was a conference in Lake Tahoe, New York, in Lake Tahoe, Nevada, and spoke there. And from there, I started to get more and more involved. And I did something that was a little unique due to the circumstances, which is instead of kind of going up the chain from secretary to treasurer to first vice president, I just ran directly for president. And I did it really kind of out of motivation at the time. And I think we're going to see, unfortunately, those kind of times today, which is it was a time in which in the late 80s, they started to go after lawyers. First they went after clients, which is what I think is happening now. And the next step typically is going after lawyers. And I just felt that AILA's response was not strong enough to be supportive of members who were lawyers. In other words, a lawyer would get indicted and everybody would kind of walk away instead of saying, well, maybe he was indicted for something that wasn't proper. And of course, what happened is the president of AILA then got indicted on a completely nonsensical kind of thing. It was ultimately thrown out and dismissed. But it shows you, if the government wants to focus and target on ending immigration, as I believe this administration does, that, they go after the clients, which I think they're doing today, trying to find fraud or any way to deny an application. And then when they're not satisfied with that, they go after the lawyers. And that's what happened in the late 80s. I felt very strongly about it. I felt that AILA's response at that time was not sufficient. So I said, I'm going to run. And much to everybody's shock and amazement, I won.
I agree with your sentiment, and that's something that this podcast is for immigration lawyers. It's something we have to remember, that does happen, and it's inevitable with the vitriol that this administration has towards immigration, and this stuff. Jeff Sessions was calling lawyers dirty names and all this kind of stuff.
Right.
That's where things are heading. So we have to, as an association, focus on that. Now, the stuff at the border is really important. The stuff happening to our clients is important, but inevitably this is going to lead to us, and so we have to be prepared for that.
I absolutely believe that to be true. I'm starting to see it. I've gotten a couple of calls from lawyers where judges are threatening bar charges, where they're starting to put pressure on the lawyers, because my view simply is that this administration wants to end all immigration. It's not about just people at the border. We're seeing cases of L's, E's, people in EB1 categories where they're accusing them of making false statements. One person came to us on an L1, $100 million investment in the U.S. They looked at his applications that he filed at the embassy to get a non-immigrant visa. They looked at every single application and tried to show that there were inconsistencies to try and make a fraud charge. And inevitably, the next step is to say the lawyer assisted in that fraud charge. So, I think lawyers need to be super lawyers now, extremely careful, and they need to realize that we're really in a war with this administration over immigration.
Yeah, it's crazy. So what kind of work did you do at that time when you became president to help challenge these things?
Well, that was a very busy time when they were passing legislation. We set up committees to help lawyers, to assist lawyers who may be facing criminal charges, to try and give some support to them.
Mm-hmm.
And we really did something that I don't think people realize today. From 1940 really until I think I became president, AILA was a very closed shop.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the meetings were in New York City, or almost all of them were in New York City. Very few people became presidents of AILA unless they were from New York or Philadelphia, so that the bar was really restricted to the Northeast. Charlie Foster, I believe, was the first president before me who came from outside of the Northeast. And then Dale Schwartz, who was right before me, became the second president. But AILA was kind of a closed organization. When they had their association meetings with the agency, then Immigration and Naturalization Service, or the Department of State, or the Department of Labor, you had the same people going each year, every year. And I think the major thing that I did is make AILA a much more lawyer-friendly organization. We really opened up the organization. We got many, many more people involved. The membership jumped pretty substantially. Remember, at that time it was only 3,000 or 4,000.
Yeah.
So it jumped pretty substantially. And I think that was due to the policy of, we're going to change everything. We're going to start having new people, new faces. We're giving younger people a chance. And that's what happened. And I feel my contribution to AILA was to really open it up to make it much more of a national organization.
Great work. Yeah. And it really has become that. When you go to the conferences nowadays, it's just like, it's this whole big thing. It's amazing what's become of AILA. And when did you start the book process? How did that come about?
A very interesting story about my book. I teach, and at that time I was teaching at two law schools, Nova University, which I'm since not teaching, and the University of Miami School of Law, where I still teach an advanced immigration class. And in 1990, I was teaching the class, and I had notes. Remember, this was before people had everything computerized. So lawyers who date back in those years used to keep files on everything, right? I mean, you have a file on 212C, you'd have a file on 212H, and you'd keep them in your office, in your library or whatever, and you'd pull them out whenever you had an issue. And other than Immigration Law and Procedure, which is a wonderful treatise, but I think not comprehensible in those days. I think it's different now, but not comprehensible in those days to lawyers starting out and so forth. So I kept this outline for my class. I kept amplifying the outline, which was a way, instead of putting things in files, to put it on the outline. And my wife suggested that I publish it. And I said to her, I don't think anybody would want to read it. I mean, why would anybody want to read this outline, right? And remember, the book was very, very small. If you go back in those days, even the Code of Federal Regulations was very small. And so it was very different at that time. And I published the book. And as you know, each publication, every 2 years, we added more and more and more. And now, you know, a book that was probably 600 pages, 500 pages is now over 2,200.
Mm-hmm.
So each year it changes. And that, of course, is one of the things I want to remind people, that if you have the 15th edition of my book, it's now on the 16th, it's out of date. You need to get the 16th. And
Yeah.
next year, next June, the 17th will come out, and the 16th is going to be grossly out of date. Why? I mean, just look at all the changes in the last year, the changes at the border, the changes on asylum practice, the new regulations that just came out this week on EB-5, the new regulations that came out on H-1Bs.
Mm-hmm.
All of that is not even in the current edition. So anybody who carries around an old edition, and believe me, it's not to sell books, it's because I really worry about malpractice. I worry about a lawyer looking at the 15th edition when it's out of date, it's now 3 years out of date, or looking, you know, next year at the 16th edition when it may be out of date because of all the changes in the law. So if you have a 14th edition or a 13th or a 15th edition, they're out of date and people shouldn't be using them. I know the book costs a lot, but it costs less than what it would to do half a case, and it certainly costs less than what it would to defend yourself in a malpractice.
Now, how does putting together a book like that work nowadays? I mean, when the book was smaller decades ago, it take less time, but nowadays with every day the changes coming in, is there like a full-time person or people that are just updating it every day, I'd imagine, or how does that work?
You're looking at them.
Really?
Yeah. I do the book myself, actually.
Oh, wow.
I read all the published decisions, not all the unpublished, but all the published decisions, and once in a while an unpublished one, one that's not submitted for publication if a lawyer sends it and thinks it's really important. I read all the new regs. I read all the, you know, the policy manual, everything that comes out that's a change, I read, and I put it in the book. And that takes me about 1,500 hours a year. It's like a second job, really, because I'm still practicing full time. But at the end, I have the benefit of people from the National Immigration Project, people from AILA who specialize in specific areas. They've been nice enough to, you know, they'll take a small chunk of the book and review it. You know, they'll review adoptions, for example, or they'll review the O and P sections, people, you know, who specialize in entertainment or something like that. So I get the benefit of people's knowledge, and I think that, you know, ensures that the book is accurate, up to date, you know, from the day we publish it. The other thing I try to do is get it as up to date as possible right before publication. In other words, the book comes out in June. Normally a book that comes out in June, the last thing that's put in is probably in January in most books, maybe in February. I put in everything up to really the end of April.
Yeah.
So when they get that book in June, it's really only a month has passed since then. And if a Supreme Court case comes out, we try to stick it in the book in some way, even at the very end.
Yeah.
So
It's just like,
it's it's a full-time job. I mean,
yeah.
it just especially now
Hmm.
because now every day, literally every day, something's I mean, just yesterday, this idea of the 100-mile border. I don't
Hmm.
know if people follow that. To me, it's the most dramatic change probably in our law. Forget about immigration law. What is it saying? It's saying if you're within 100 miles of any border, which is about 85% of the population of the
Yeah.
US, because everybody, except for Dallas, Texas, every big city is within 100 miles of the
Hmm.
border, one way or another. What does it mean? It means they can stop you within that 100 miles and ask you to prove to them that you are a resident or citizen of the United States, or if you're illegal, that you've been here illegally more than 2 years. And if not, put you in expedited removal. And if people think this is hypothetical, there was a story in the press 2 days ago
Yeah.
of a young guy from Texas
Hmm.
whose parents told him, obviously, keep your birth certificate on you and keep your social security card on you, which is a little frightening to
Yeah.
tell your own child you live in a country where you have to do that because you may get picked up and stopped and then incarcerated. He was incarcerated for a month while he was on his way to go play soccer. He showed him his birth certificate, he showed him his social security, and they kept him in there until they finally decided at their own whim to release him 30 days later. And
Even yeah, even before the stats came out in the last 10 years of so many US citizens being held sometimes for months. And I think it was one guy who sued eventually was there for like many, many months. And they said the statute of limited whatever ran out for him to sue to get some money from it. But this is a catastrophe on not just the immigration level, just on the essence of life and liberty. This is straight up constitutional. This is a catastrophe. Yeah.
right, I mean, and the fact that they've now expanded it is horrific because
Hmm.
at least the former administration tried to narrow it to people at the border or coming to the border, where at least you can arguably say now they can pick up anybody within 100 miles of any border. That's all of Florida. That's all of the East Coast of the United States, New York, Philadelphia, you name the city,
Yeah.
all along the East Coast, all along the West Coast, California, right? I mean,
Yeah.
San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, all the way up, Seattle, Chicago. They now have the ability to go into a city and start to stop people, go
Yeah.
on buses, go on trains.
No
It's
search and
scary.
seizure protections. You just show up because it's national security, immigration, this and that. They can do whatever they want. It's just crazy. I would imagine even the border officers themselves would put up a fight and say this is just unpatriotic. If you're looking at that, it's crazy. I mean, the Supreme Court had said these kind of searches are okay a couple years back, which was a horrible decision. Hopefully, we could revisit that and some sanity will come. It's better to have, even if you hate illegal immigrants or unauthorized immigrants, better to have them here than have people show papers. This is such a, they talked about, the country turning into, a Nazi state or something like that. I thought that was hyperbole, but this is literally the stepping stone for that kind of stuff. And we just
Yeah,
can't let
because
that
now
happen.
they can stop you and say, "Where are your papers?"
Yeah. I mean, it was always a saying they say wear your papers, but it's literally what is going on in 2019 in America. It's just mind blowing. So that's something that's this podcast is we're hoping to do for lawyers to get together because we're the defenders of the Constitution at the end of the day. We're the court to defend people. That's our role, to put our minds together, put our money together, put our intelligence together, all this kind of stuff to just constantly challenge this stuff because it's going to destroy the country.
Well, one of the things we're trying to do, John, now is as I go through all the new changes, I did a paper about almost 2 years ago when Trump first started, and I said, here's how they're going to change immigration law without having any legislative changes.
Hmm.
And, my first list was about 10 or 15. I'm now up to over 50. My friend who teaches at Yale and at Stanford, Lucas Gutentag, has had students working on that. There have been 300 or more changes in immigration law since Trump took office. The hope is if he loses and when he loses, that the next administration will come in and reverse all of these horrible policies, because
Yeah.
there's a lot of them,
Yeah.
a
And
lot
then
more than people
his own
realize.
people are in place too, and the bureaucracy it's going to be harder to get rid of if you have just vehement anti-immigrant people in field offices that are hired. It's like, what do you do about that? And these denials, I just saw a denial from a friend who did adjustment of status for a national interest waiver, and they denied because the person had some association with some professor who might have done something wrong. They denied him for just association. It was just crazy, and he's going to file suit on that. But we're already seeing this kind of stuff.
And what we're seeing now, which I have never seen in all the years I've practiced, is the use of discretion to deny adjustments.
Hmm.
We've had several of them in our office. In fact, an immigration lawyer came in, his spouse was denied, not based on any inadmissibility ground, but just based on their own discretion. So they'll say, oh, you had a DUI, yeah, it was dismissed, but we don't think you're a good person, so we're going to deny it as a matter of discretion.
Crazy, crazy, yeah.
That's the kind of thing that's going on now, where they're, using their authority. They realize their authority is unchecked,
Yeah.
particularly by their supervisors or the administration. So they're doing anything that pops into their head as a way of denying an application.
Yeah, that's what I tell clients nowadays, because like INA 245 says, like, at the discretion of the attorney general with the old language, but that discretion, I mean, historical precedence it's all good. It's like if there was employment by the U.S. citizen spouse, that's as a matter of discretion, they'll approve it because they forgive that under INA 245C. But when the discretion term is loosey goosey, they can do what they want. Something that's been the standard operating procedure for decades all of a sudden gets switched up. It's a mess. So, I mean, what have been you've been practicing for much longer than I have. And so what have you seen since the 80s, 90s now? Obviously, the crackdown is a thing, but how has practicing immigration changed other than that in your experience over the last couple of decades?
Oh, there have been enormous changes. I mean, I think one of the watersheds was the 96 Act,
Hmm.
which was also passed by Republicans but signed by Bill Clinton, which dramatically changed immigration law. The last positive immigration act was 1990,
Hmm.
which brought in O's and P's and changed the way the numbering system worked, and brought in some other favorable things such as EB-5 and so forth. But after 90, the 1996 Act was horrendous. The
Hmm.
96 Act dramatically changed immigration because it said in the 3 and 10-year bar, if you're here in an unlawful, in a status not authorized by the Attorney General more than 6 months and you leave, you can't come back for 3 years. And if you're here more than a year in a status not authorized, you can't, and leave, you can't come back for 10 years. Well, one of the things that did is it made it impossible for people who wanted to regularize their status and do the right thing
Hmm.
for someone like an employer who has somebody taking care of their elderly family member in the home. That person may have been out of status. Before 96, they were able to petition for them, get the labor certification because they could prove that there are no US workers, then get their petition approved. And the only penalty was that person had to go back home to get their green card. They couldn't adjust in the United States.
Hmm.
Well, in 96, what they eventually did was to say, yes, you can do the first 2 steps, but that third step, once you leave the US, you're not coming back for 10 years.
Yeah.
So that wiped out a huge portion of labor certifications because there was no point in doing them unless somebody was in lawful status. And so what did it do? Here, this is why it's so interesting, because the Republicans keep talking about we have 11 million undocumented people, and Trump keeps talking about how we have to get rid of them. The 96 law passed by Republicans created that 11 million backlog, because most of those people over a period of time would have gotten a labor certification, and the penalty would have been that they just had to go home, pick up their green card, and come back. Or they would be in a second preference, in a fourth preference case, where the only penalty was they could go home to pick up their card. They couldn't adjust, but they would just go home. I mean, think about it now. You're in a second preference case. You have to wait 3 years. You're married to a U.S. resident, and the resident petitions for you. Now it's 2 years down the road. Okay, your spouse is out of status now for a year. They can't adjust because they're out of status. And if they leave, they can't come back for 10 years without a waiver. And what they did is they molded the waivers to make them almost useless. That was the second major change in the 96 law. For example, it used to be, you're asking me about the changes in the law. It used to be the case if you made a material misrepresentation, if you had a spouse, parent, or child, and you could show hardship, you could get a waiver. And the waivers for 212A6CI, a material misrepresentation at the border or fraud, were relatively easy to get because all you had to do is show hardship, not extreme hardship. 96, Lamar Smith, who was the chairman, hired people from FAIR to basically rewrite the 96 law that ultimately became the 96 law. So they're smart. They knew what they were doing. It's just like the people running immigration today. They're worthy adversaries. Took 212I, the waiver provision, they added one word and they took out one word. They took out child, a waiver based on a child, and they added extreme to the word hardship. Because they knew politically they couldn't just do away with the waivers. So what they did is make them useless. A 212I waiver, once you took out child and added extreme, meant that about 70% or more of the people who would be eligible for a waiver weren't getting it anymore. And they did that across the board. They did it with the 3 and 10 year bar. Same thing. No, you can't get a waiver based on a child, which is most waivers, and you can't get it unless you could show extreme hardship. And they did the same thing with the 212H waiver. They added lots of things. They took out 212C, which used to be a way in which no matter what your conviction was, the judge was given equity to balance the waivers, right? To balance your hardship against your conviction. And 70% of the time, they would grant a 212C waiver. They got rid of a 212C waiver. They put in cancellation, but they put in all of these things in cancellation that made it impossible for many people to get any benefit. If you're an aggravated felon, you can't get cancellation. If you're subject to the stop time rule, you can't get cancellation, right? So what they did is they kept a form of relief, but they shrunk it to the point where in most cases it was meaningless. So if you have an aggravated felony today, you're out, right? There's no waiving of the hardship. There's no looking at your case. And then they did something that actually was very smart. From 1988 until the 1996, they kept dropping the bar on aggravated felons. Remember, when aggravated felony started in the 80s, it was major drug trafficking, major arms trafficking, or murder. That was it. Today, as you know, an 18-year-old can steal a bike, it's theft, get a year suspended sentence, and he's an aggravated felon. So it was a very coordinated effort, very smart, and it's the same thing they're doing today administratively.
Yeah.
They know how to play with the system, and they're doing it in ways that are pretty astonishing, you know.
Yeah, what they're doing with the public charge rule, and they're testing it out and see what it is. It's just masterful. They're really they got some experts that know how to tweak and push the points that they can get away with constant non-reviewability. And the nasty thing about the public charge is, if people have 601A waivers, those get canceled out. They fix the public charge issue, which a lot of times it's like an incorrect assessment by the officer, and then they have to request another waiver. They're stuck outside for a year, re-adjudicate that. It's so nasty, like these kind of things that they do for people that's going through such hardship already.
And it's not random. I mean, I think they really understand the immigration law.
Yeah.
Some people told me, I don't want to acknowledge this, but some people told me, they've gone through my book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean,
and they found everything that could be considered a loophole and trying to change it and to make it worse and worse. And so when the Republicans complain about the 11 million, my response is, you passed the 3 and 10-year bar. You passed mandatory detention. You passed expedited removal. And that's why we're in the situation we're in today. I mean, you changed the 212I waiver, and that's one of the reasons today why when you get any case, whether it's a naturalization case, an adjustment case, what they're doing is they're taking every single thing you ever filed, everything. If you filed a B2 application at, DS 160 at the consulate, if you filed a change of status, they're laying them all out and they're saying, how can we get this guy or this woman on fraud? How can we show that they made a material misrepresentation? Because they know if they can do that, they're permanently barred because the waiver is so difficult to obtain. And then, of course, they're making it much more difficult to get an approval of an extreme hardship waiver or an I-6, like you were saying, an I-601A waiver. So, you have all of these things going on simultaneously where they're doing it in a very coordinated effort to just grind immigration to a halt. And I believe it's across the board. So,
yeah, it's just a travesty what's going on. Now, with regards to the outside and consular processing, what have been your experiences with the travel ban, and what have you seen with cases or things you've done in that area? Have you dealt with the waiver or had approvals and stuff like that for waivers, for those kind of waivers?
Obviously it's very difficult because it's consular processing. So you have the doctrine of no review.
Yeah.
And so you're up against that bar, although at least there's some room as a result of the Supreme Court's decision to argue a facially legitimate and bona fide test. On the waivers, remember in the decision in the Supreme Court on Hawaii versus Trump, the court in part relied on the availability of a waiver as a reason to deal with all this. So I think you can use that language if you're going into court and you're suing the government on either mandamus, the refusal to these waivers, as you know, sit there for many, many, many months, sometimes years, and they just don't adjudicate them.
Yeah.
So a mandamus is at least one way of trying to do that. The second thing is suing them directly for being arbitrary and capricious. They have left out, kind of granted a series of criteria for granting a waiver, and I think we can use that criteria to say they're not following it.
Yeah.
So our experience has been we're trying to litigate some of these issues, but principally we're going back to them and saying, follow your own criteria, and here is the criteria, and this person, is eligible. And if they don't do anything, we mandamus them.
Yeah, it's just the gears of the justice system move so slowly. There's some good lawsuits coming to directly challenge this stuff, and some embassies won't even touch waiver packet if you send it. So it's like that's not happening. I have cases that were administrative processing before the trial ban even came into effect, or was even talked about, and years go by, they're still stuck. They never had the opportunity to talk with an officer to explain their hardship, and they're just in this pending status as spouses, parents of U.S. citizens. And these people, their lives are falling apart. It's just a travesty. It's so sad just talking to them and not having an answer other than suing. And people are, hesitant. They're like, I'm going to sue the government. And a lot of these countries, that option is not available. It seems kind of crazy or scary to them. But now it's in a part of the goal of this podcast. Like, no, that's a normal thing to do. I was reading a New York Times article that President Trump does everything in expectation of being sued and sorting it out in court later in his personal commercial life. Someone had said that in the article. And so to him, it's just like, oh, it's just part of business suing. So if that's part of business, then it's something we should all do and get part of and support. Because it seems like until the political will comes into play in Congress and we have changes, the courts, the executive, it's not happening. So the judiciary is the way to go until the legislator gets its act together.
Yeah, but I think we really need to do both. I think we've relied on the judiciary. He's trying to pack the courts now, as
Yeah,
you know.
he's very successful in that. Yeah.
Be harder in the future in relying on the judiciary. I think people really have to start organizing politically.
Mm-hmm.
I started an organization about 10 years ago called Immigrants List, which has a political action component and a C4 organization. We're doing ads. We're trying to get people involved. We're trying to raise a lot of money to do ads on TV so people will realize some of the issues that we're talking about, that this isn't just, kind of an illegal alien with a criminal record trying to sneak in the country, which is, what Trump does from the White House, trying to picture everyone as he says, a bad hombre, right?
Yeah.
One of the things we need to do is to organize in that way. And I would urge the people listening to this to go look at our website, www.immigrantslist.org, and with an S, immigrantlist.org, and make a contribution, get involved, do what you can if you want to do a fundraiser, because what we're doing is we're trying to create a different consciousness about immigration. And one of the ways you do that is by doing ads. I'll give you one example that we've done in the last month. Trump is trying to court the Venezuelan vote in Florida. He's saying how he's going to do this and he's going to do that, and he's going to go into Venezuela and change the government. And so we said, well, what about TPS for Venezuelans if you're so concerned about that? So we ran a series of ads in Miami on Trump's a hypocrite. He's talking about changing Venezuela, but he won't help the Venezuelans here to give them TPS. They already rejected it last week. He won't do anything to help the Venezuelans who are appearing at the southern border. He's treating them just like everybody else. So, there are things that we can do to let people in the country understand that these aren't, some criminal alien just trying to sneak in the country. And that's important. So to the extent that people do that, and then I have to say, for the first time in my life, I've taken on to Twitter. So I've started to do things every day on different issues.
That's wonderful. What is your Twitter handle?
It's Ira Kurzban.
Ira Kurzban, okay. Great. Yeah, I hear that. Any way you can change the narrative, and Twitter is a good place, especially it's a marketing tidbit, but it helps in this kind of stuff too. Follow people that are reporters that handle immigration matters for AP, for Bloomberg, all this kind of stuff. And if you have some good stuff, just tag them. You do @ in their name, so they see that what you're posting, what your commentary is, and they can pick it up and help change the narrative that's happening. Because the last thing we want is what the administration is pushing, that these are all MS-13 gang members, when it's just children, family members. It's like the picture is completely different than what they picture it as, just regular people. And so we really have to let people know these are just human beings we're dealing with. And we have systems, we have a court. If someone is here unauthorized, we could check them out and do background checks and all this kind of stuff, which we do, reasonable ones, not these fake ones. But there's process for it. And I mean, our country is based on immigration. It's made of immigrants. To just do these police state kind of tactics, it's going to destroy you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, just destroying everything with these kind of methods. So it's just not wise. Just put it that way. Like, even if you don't believe in immigration, the way they're doing it is just insanity. It's going to hurt everybody, and you're shooting yourself in the foot the way they're handling it, just because of the vitriol they have against immigrants and political points that it brings.
Yeah, I mean, and I think what you said at the beginning is true. I don't think most lawyers understand this. We're the front line. We're the defenders of the Constitution. We're the defenders of immigrants' rights, because there's not going to be very many people who are going to get there and do that unless you have lawyers speaking up and explaining why people have rights, what those rights are, and why it's important to all of us. I mean, like the thing we were talking about before about the 100-mile thing. It's not about immigrants. It's about everybody.
Yeah.
Because if they can stop anybody on the street, that affects American citizens, our children, our parents, our brothers and sisters. It affects everyone. So we've got to get that message across, and there's nobody better than doing that, I think, than immigration lawyers.
Definitely. It's part of our job now. It's not just filing an I-140 or a motion in court. It's just a grander situation we found ourselves in. It's one of those things when things happen in history where people have to step up and they weren't expecting it, but all of a sudden, you took on this job, you took an oath, and you labeled yourself an immigration attorney. And so it's just a responsibility that comes with it. Even if you didn't want it, even if it comes with heat and pressure, we don't really have a choice. It's just one of those, the times have come and we have to really step up. Yeah.
Right.
Oh man, so yeah, this is stuff you see in storybooks, or you talk about, 100 years ago when things would happen, civil rights movement, and you should read about it in books and stuff. But we're really living through this stuff, and it's unimaginable. I have children. I'm Persian Iranian background, and with the political situation between the two countries, and pretty much it's a Cold War going on between the two countries. Now I have children. They're going to grow up in a world where potentially we're going to be blacklisted because of our last name and how we look. And so it's going to affect everybody. If it's not just people from South America, it's going to be Iranians, then it's going to be definitely Chinese, because they're going to assume they're all spies. And then the Russians, poor Russian people, between the governments, we have these problems. But these poor Russian people come here and they get hit by it. And they keep saying the Russians are doing this, Russians, this and that. But, they're just regular people. The Indians are constantly getting hit. And so it's like, these are people who made America. I was doing a podcast and doing the research on, when America started and what the situation of immigration was. And, citizenship was one of the most important situations they had with the crown, because they wouldn't allow people to naturalize here in the way to make it easy for people to come and do that. But when you read, Benjamin Franklin didn't like the Germans. He was really anti-German. It was interesting to see this kind of stuff exist at the time. But they said, they still worked it out, and now Germans are one of the biggest populations of historical immigrants here, and who see themselves as Americans, and so it's just amazing how that stuff always exists, but you have to just challenge it and push your way forward, because that's what's the difference between America. That's what makes us great. And in China, everyone, the government wants everyone to be Han Chinese, and in all these countries, it's always about a mono ethnicity that dominates and stuff. But America, that even though Caucasianness and being white has been the dominant aspect, but within that there's just a mix of people, and there was so much understanding, openness, not fully, obviously went through civil rights and all that, but there was an openness. And that really is, I think, critical to our power, is we have all these minds, all these people, and frankly we take away a lot of the greatest minds from other countries and bring it here, and leaves them at a comparative advantage. So we're really hurting ourselves. The F1 student visa, for example, the really stupid thing about the DS situation and accumulating lawful presence, they're investing hundreds of thousands of dollars to come to school here, become engineers, and then we're going to kick them out to take all that technology education they got to somewhere else. Why would you not want to keep that here? These people aren't going to be losers that come public charge. They're going to be making money for everybody. Just look at Silicon Valley. It just doesn't make so much sense in my head that I could raise my voice. I'm sorry, but this is going to be controversial. What is your opinion on the employment-based legislation that's going forward about
Yeah,
readjusting country conditions,
I
limitations.
know there's lots of different views. I would urge the people listening to this to look at Rand Paul's Believe
Yeah,
Act, because the Believe Act actually tries to address all the issues. That is by, the backlogs, obviously, in India, China, but elsewhere as well, by increasing the numbers, which is what ultimately you have to do. But more importantly, doing away with counting derivatives.
yeah, that's it. That's the main thing. Yeah.
And or you may know, we have a lawsuit in Washington, D.C., challenging the counting of derivatives. It's a very tough case. It's on behalf of EB5 investors who are seeing their kids age out while they're waiting longer and longer times. So we brought a case on behalf of 500 Chinese investors saying the government does not have to count the visas they give family members. If you look at Section 203D of the Act, it doesn't mandate that.
Yeah.
The only place it's mandated is in the FAM, which is not law.
It's
So
purely regulatory, internal regulations. It's nothing statutory. Yeah.
right, there's not even an internal State Department regulation or an internal USCIS regulation. The only places in the FAM where they say about how to count and so forth. But it's a very, very difficult case for lots of reasons I don't need to go into.
Yeah.
The real solution to this is legislative. That is, Rand Paul's Believe Act says, let's not count derivatives.
Mm-hmm.
They can come, they're part of the family unit. And to show you how crazy this is, remember on EB5, it said 10,000 visas to create 100,000 jobs. Each person is supposed to create 10 jobs for US workers. Well, in fact, only 3,300 investors come. The rest are used up by their family members.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not creating 100,000 jobs, you're creating 33,000 jobs at most, because you're letting the family members use the other visas. I don't think that's what Congress intended.
No.
That's why, we sued on it. But as I said, I think the solution is not 1044, which I see as just really, quite frankly, Zoe Lofgren, who I admire a good deal, but I think who did this for her constituents, who are the high-tech companies who made promises to Indian citizens who've been sitting unjustifiably for years and years and years. But you don't play off one group against the other. And the problem with this legislation, 1044, is it's going to mean eventually that everybody has a backlog of 9-10 years, which will kill all employment-based immigration. Yeah. So the way to really do it is try to get Rand Paul's bill incorporated into the Senate bill in some way, because that has the provisions to alleviate a lot of these problems. You can get rid of per country limitations, which is what 1044 does. But if you just do that, you're creating havoc, and you're creating a system where down the road there's going to be no visas for anybody employment-based.
It's just such a narrow thing. There's still going to be huge lags of time before the visa issuance happens and all this kind of stuff. So it doesn't make any sense, that legislation, the way it's designed. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Rand Paul legislation is definitely good. People have their opinions on Rand Paul and his position and his party, all that. But that's the way to go if you're going to be changing stuff on, because right now, even the visa bulletin, EB1A category on general got backlogged, pushed back to 2016. It's crazy. We have China, not only is it China in EB5 backlog, but India, and then now Vietnam, and they're just going to be added to it. So it's such a the employment-based category is being decimated, and even the administration keeps pushing the idea that we want more people that are skilled workers coming. Well, they're just employment-based not working. Yeah, it's not true.
I think that's one of the big lies here. I honestly believe that they just don't want immigration.
Yeah.
Period. Like what you were saying before, it's in our economic interest to have high-skilled, people here, investors here. They don't want anybody here.
Yeah.
And I really believe that. I think this is what Trump means by make America great again. It means make America white again. It's like the old national origins quota system that we had, in the
Hmm.
1920s. They want to do that administratively, in effect, by
But
just,
even that, I'm hearing these stories about the embassy in London being such a headache to deal with for consular processing. So it's just generally halting all. It's just stopping immigration in general, but
yeah.
it just doesn't make any sense. I mean, yeah, it just doesn't make any sense to just completely stop it because the engines the gears are just being shot down. It affects everybody. Definitely what you said about his. I mean, he even said he was quoted about his preferences of who can migrate. But yeah, it's just I'm at a loss of words, but I'm glad we got to talk about the details of a way to challenge these kind of things, and it really just comes from people making a decision to say I'm not going to handle this anymore. I'm going to go in and do something about it.
I think we got to get people who are going to listen to this to start calling their senators and ask them, where are you on the Believe Act?
Hmm.
Why aren't you supporting it? It's the real solution to the problem, not the bills that are pending in the Congress that be disasters. And, those kind of contacts, believe it or not, actually matter. A group of people going up to Washington or meeting a senator in their home state, while they're there and telling
Hmm.
them, look, this is an important issue. It's an important issue to all of us. Please do something about it. I think it makes a difference. I really do. And that's why, we started Immigrants List, and that's why, we've been at it all the time. We were successful in getting 70% of the people we supported elected. So now we have people like Catherine Mastos, in Nevada, who's really pro-immigration, Jackie Rosen in Nevada, who's really pro-immigration, the senator from Illinois, Tammy Duckworth, who
Hmm.
started with us when Immigrants List first started. She's very pro-immigration and willing to help. That's what we need. Debbie Mercasell Powell here in South Florida, a bunch of members of Congress who we supported. We got over 70% of them elected. That's what people need to do. You got to get in there. You got to
Yeah.
fight for it. It's just not going to
And
happen
hold their
otherwise.
feet to the fire once they're there, keep continuing it. Yeah, last night I emailed the office for Dianne Feinstein. I'm in California, and I said, listen, I'm a immigration attorney. I'm a professor at two law schools. This doesn't make sense. It's not going to do any good. We have to really not let the Senate, because it already passed the Congress or representatives. We got to just stop it, support Rand Paul's bill to make some reasonable changes and just adjust that. But it's got to be constant pressure, constantly on top of it, and I guess organizing is a way. So that's why I made this podcast. So it's very niche for immigration attorneys. So I don't want everybody listening, because then once it gets too big, it kind of gets unwieldy. But if we have this concerted effort from people that are dedicated to say, okay, yeah, I'm going to email them and call them today, and then I'm also going to be on this list to remember to call them later, or to put pressure on this time, or give money to this part. We got to put our money where our mouth is to it, and really just support in any way it can, because we're going to be out of a living. I mean, take it to purely on a trade perspective. If this continues, there's not going to be an immigration attorney, because there's not going to be an immigrant. That's the goal of the administration.
That's right.
Or the work you do is going to be so frustrating that you're going to want to not do it anymore. And it's such a good job to have as an immigration attorney. The clients to deal with, I love them. It makes me so happy, and to see just everything we do, and to stop that, and it helps the country so much. Is really it's a good end. And then we're gonna have to be other kinds of lawyers that's not as much fun and pleasurable. So that's the last thing we want. So we got to make sure we challenge this stuff. Before we go, is there anything else you want to tell the audience, and also any ways to contact you is the best way to learn more about your work, and anything you have?
Yeah, I mean, they could, go on our website. It's kktplaw.com. But I would also urge them to really look at Immigrants List and look at what we're doing, make a donation, get involved. Doesn't have to be a big donation, but at least get involved. And if you can't get involved in that, just do what you were just saying. Directly contact your member of Congress, both the senators and the House member in the district you're in. Let them know how bad things are, what's going on, what they should support, like the Believe Act, and go from there. I mean, we cannot be passive. Also, people need to sue. If they don't know how to sue, they can call and get assistance through AILA. If they don't want to do it, there are guys like us who do this all the time. We're happy to represent people who who need to go to federal court, because we need to do that a lot more. But if you want to learn to do it yourself as a lawyer, there's plenty of mechanisms to learn to do it. And, my office is always open. People can email me, and I'm happy to answer any questions they have.
That's wonderful. That's so kind of you, Ira. Thank you so much for coming on the show, and I hope we could do this again sometime. I look forward to seeing you at the next AILA conference, I think, in San Diego.
Thanks a lot, John.
That was
Be
a pleasure.
well. Take care.
Bye-bye.